Hello, everyone. I'm joined today with James Desborough. How are you doing?
All right. It's Desborough, is how it's
Desborough.
pronounced.
Oh, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
Desborough, like a borough of New York, right?
Right. Sorry,
Okay,
James,
but
but hey.
everyone knows me as Grim. So
Yeah, we've actually talked back in the old days, I believe, a little bit. And you, of course, wrote Inside GamerGate, and you were involved with the currently in develop, well, finished but unpublished currently, Airplay Documentary. So
yeah,
you've dedicated some
um,
time to this.
yeah, yeah. With the book, I felt it was important to have a sort of historical account from inside the movement, especially considering how biased all the other media was and how Wikipedia was still is absolutely pathetic on Gamergate. I tried to be as even-handed as possible. I haven't got that much involvement in the film, the documentary. It uses the audiobook version of my book as part of the framing device of the documentary, along with Airplay. So yeah, I'm not directly involved, but I'm supportive and allow them to use my work.
Speaking of audiobook versions, I regrettably have not yet made one. I planned on it at the time, but other stuff came up in real life and I never got around to it.
Yeah, it's tough, especially because you spot all the extra errors that you thought you'd gotten rid of
Yeah,
when it actually comes to reading it live. So, yeah,
this
but
is
it's worth
true.
doing.
All right. Well, hey, actually, before we jump in too much, do you want to? You said you think it was important for historical reasons. What made this such an important thing to you? This Gamergate book.
Uh, the ways in which it was a rerun of previous moral panics that I had lived through. So, the Satanic Panic, and particularly with regards to tabletop role playing games, and the Video Nasty Panic here in the UK, kind of prosecuted in part by Mary Whitehouse and other famous censorious figures. So on the one hand, you can draw a line through from Frederick Wortham through Pat Pulling through Jack Thompson all the way through to Gamergate. Um, and I felt that was an important thing to note, to place it in its historical context. And
What?
then I was also extremely aware that our story wasn't going to be recorded fairly or accurately, if at all. So I felt it was important, while it was still relatively fresh in my mind, to get as much down as I could, with citations, trying to be as even-handed as possible, but representing the movement as I had experienced it from inside it.
It's that's the same reason I wrote my book. That I didn't think that we were ever going to. Well, someone had to. Someone had to represent the truth and what really happened. And I tried to be fair-minded too. Like I think my book has a pro Gamergate bias slightly maybe. Um, just because I wrote it, but I'm very upfront about that. And I did run it by an anti-Gamergate person, and I did include a lot um, of commentary, like not just taken out of context, of course not, absolutely, but like absolutely like multiple paragraphs or long things from anti-Gamergate people, to try and like balance it out. Be like, hey, look, here's what they were, not just like dumb arguments. I mean, like really good arguments that people made. Like I believe I quote Hannah Zamora actually in the book. It was really important to me. But it's interesting you talk about the moral panic framing because that's sort of how I saw it, part of it, a lot of it at the time. But nobody talks about that framing too much anymore. Now all people want to talk about is like, oh well, Gamer Gators just hated women.
Yeah. which wasn't really true at all ever of Gamergate. I mean, maybe the kind of stuff that was going on directly preceding it. But I mean that is a big part of the moral panic and has continued to be a moral panic. I think it's still going in various forms. So we went from comics will turn kids into juvenile delinquents to D&D will make kids kill themselves to heavy metal will turn your child into a magic wielding Satanist to violent video games and murder simulators, and then video games will turn your kid into Andrew Tate. It's just it's all absurd. It's the same argument with different set dressing throughout the ages, and that's how I saw it from the get-go.
Well, I don't want to jump too much into being critical, but wouldn't some people on the other side of this debate say that, hey, look, what really happened was that some people thought that they should bring an academic feminist critique into gaming, and a lot of gamers weren't happy with this. They thought that that this was wrong. They weren't familiar with these kind of arguments. They never heard about cultivation theory before or critical theory, and they didn't know how to handle all this. So some of them engaged in harassment. Others just made really stupid arguments on the internet because they didn't really know what they were talking about. And there wasn't really an attempt to censor people. It was really just an attempt to say, hey, look, here's our critical analysis of this work from a feminist perspective. And they couldn't really handle that. So the gamers just freaked out.
Right. So, oh god, there's a lot I could spin off from that. Firstly, I think those approaches to media criticism are bollocks. Um, if you go in to anything with a bias, whether it be a feminist bias or a masculinist bias or a Christian bias or whatever, if you go looking for something, you're going to find it. It's a form of pareidolia. It's like the number 23 or whatever. If you become sensitized to something, you're going to see it. And it's not very academic, I don't think, to completely and unquestioningly embrace bias and to commit to death of the author to the extent that they do. And it was obvious to anyone who was involved in games that the majority of this criticism was ill-informed. So for them to say, "Oh, you just can't handle our academic analysis," well, the academic analysis was deeply, deeply lacking in a huge number of ways. And I don't think it was limited to criticism. I mean, things got so utterly ludicrous that Sarkeesian and Quinn went before the United Nations, for Christ's sake, you know, and were brought into companies to make changes to the modes of expression and so on that were going on within those companies. Those aren't the only cases. Those aren't the only people to do that, and that is a step far beyond mere criticism. I just think it's thoroughly disingenuous to say that they weren't calling for change or censorship. And certainly their work was being used by people, whether they like it or not, to call for censorship and change. And all based on these misapprehensions about gaming, about the community, all of it. Many of my criticisms are academic. So
You said that they wanted to bring about censorship and change. Well, censorship, I think everyone agrees, is bad. Well, they should maybe, I don't know. That's my view, it's bad. But when it comes to change, I mean, like, society is constantly changing. We're the kinds of things that you could put in a movie and not receive any flack for 50 years ago are different from the things that you can do today. And maybe some of those are gone too far in one direction, but maybe some of the changes are also good, right? Maybe it's good that we don't have people in blackface in movies anymore, right?
I can think of ways in which it would still work in some instances.
Tropic
I
Thunder.
could think of Tropic Thunder. Yeah, there was an episode of Jeeves and Wooster that was making fun of the whole black and white minstrel show sort of thing, and I think it's wrong to erase history for modern sensibilities. So if you were creating a show or a film or something set in the era where these things were common, leaving it out is whitewashing history. So that's not a good thing. Also, I don't think all change is progress. It is possible for things to go backwards. Change can be regressive as well. And I think a lot of these forces, these groups, these, well, I would call them pseudo academics if I'm feeling a bit spicy. Like they try to spin up their personal distaste into a big societal problem. Now, if your criticism is, I don't like XYZ, that's fine. And I don't think anyone would have any problem with that. But when you try to spin it up into XYZ is causing the downfall of civilization, it contributes to the patriarchy or rape culture or whatever, you're saying like this is something that has to be changed. You're not just offering a criticism.
Is it possible that something could both be sexist and promote sexism to some minute degree and also be like acceptable because it has other qualities that we find artistic or useful, and therefore it's not necessarily a call for change if they have a more nuanced accounting of how they view that?
I mean, the argument always seems to boil down to these cultural items can brainwash people into bad things, but not me because I'm a big brain, clever person that analyzes this stuff, which is rather patronizing. um,
Well, hey, we
yeah,
could.
so
Oh,
it does always overextend. So I've lost my train of thought. Can you repeat that last question?
if some, could they also hold the view that yes, this thing probably does contribute to like a sexist atmosphere or culture in society, and that might be bad, but we probably don't want to censor it, and we don't even necessarily want it to change because there could perhaps be other redeeming qualities about the work that make it worthwhile to still have this in existence, even if it does do some harm in some ways.
So I still think it's very hard to prove any kind of link of harm. I don't think there is really, when you look at meta studies or you look at it all in the round, in the whole, there's really almost nothing to suggest that in a pluralistic media culture, you can genuinely change people's behavior. I mean, part of the problem is that the only really rigorous studies that we seem to have address things like pornography, which is much more extreme, and I suppose you could say potentially dangerous than anything in a computer game could be. But what we've found there in pornography is that men who use a lot of pornography, perhaps overcompensating for something, tend to be more feminist, more egalitarian. They tend to have more progressive viewpoints. And that it doesn't turn, what they call violent pornography, doesn't turn men into rampaging sex beasts. If anything, the opposite. But you do find that that kind of media also attracts people who are, off the rails. But then it may have a prophylactic effect on what they do. I mean, the amount of violent crime went down abruptly with the mass availability of computer game entertainment technology. It's only a correlation. We can't say a causation. But if it was turning people violent, you'd expect the opposite. And so it seems to go for all of these kind of social indicators. So that whole idea just doesn't seem to hold any water outside of monocultures like North Korea, where there's only one message.